Welcome to the latest episode of Taxplaining, where we will dive into tax reform and talk about everything that's up for grabs in the tax bills, what's going on with legislation, what to expect. Our guest today, I'm super excited. I've been dying to talk to you, Chrissy. We follow your posts on LinkedIn and you always have such great information. We have Chrissy Green with Steptoe Johnson, a tax attorney, tax policy, and legislative expert. And she is going to help us understand what is going on in the world of tax reform in 2025.
I think to set the stage, we should probably go back in time a little bit to November of 2024 when Trump was elected again. I think a lot of people were sort of wondering, okay, what would the policies be? What would the important things be that Congress was doing that Trump would be doing in 2025? And my line has always been tax is the agenda. It's tax. Yes, there's immigration to deal with. Yes, there's energy policies. There's wars going on. There's all sorts of things that are very important. But at the end of the day, Congress is very focused on tax reform this year. The reason they're super focused is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed in late 2017, came into effect January 1, 2018. Many provisions of that sweeping tax law are set to expire at the end of this year. If they expire, taxes go up for a lot of people. There's a lot of debate out there. You will see it in news stories. You'll see it in the media. Oh, taxes only go up for the wealthy, so this isn't a big deal. But frankly, I don't believe that personally. I think when you look at the numbers, you look at the data, will taxes go up for everyone? No, but a lot of people. And so if you're a congressional member, you're concerned about where your votes are coming from. If Congress can't get this done, they can't extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they can't make additional tax changes, a lot of people in the general public are not going to be happy with them. So this is the agenda for 2025. And Congress is now in a position after the elections where the Republicans have a very slim majority to get this done. And they can use the infamous reconciliation method to do it. And what's really critical about the reconciliation process for passing laws is that they only need a simple majority in the Senate to pass the law. They don't have to have 60 votes in the Senate, which the Republicans do not have. So if the Republicans can get unity on this tax bill and get almost every Republican congressional member on board and work with President Trump, they can get tax legislation passed under this reconciliation method. And the reconciliation method, of course, is what was used to pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in late 2017.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this is not a new process to Congress. This is something that's been used before for sweeping tax legislation, tax reform. I'm glad you went back and set the stage looking at the changes that were enacted with the TCJA, because that was such a game changer. And it seems like it took a lot of practitioners a long time to catch up to those changes. It took a while for the regulations to come out, such as I was working closely with the qualified opportunity zones provisions at the time. And I remember there was so much uncertainty in how that would be interpreted and how that law is so complex. And so I think it is important to remember that this is not a new process. It seems like in the political world, things kind of reset or people forget. Maybe the public forgets, oh, we've done this before.
I think the Republicans are going to have a harder time than they think to get total unity on everything that folks want in the tax legislation. There's just so many components to it. But actually, to your point that people forget that reconciliation has been used in the past, it was used for ARPA, the American Rescue Plan in 2021 for the additional COVID relief. So it's not a new process. And honestly, I think as politics have gotten so where the margins on either side, right, either party are so razor thin all the time, I really think that reconciliation is probably the way our government's going to be doing a lot of passing laws and for the future, honestly.
That is really interesting to me. And from what I understand, reconciliation bills evolved from measures intended to reduce deficits into actually permitting increased deficits. So while reconciliation is something that has been around a while, that shift, I think, is relatively recent and something to consider because the very core of why reconciliation bills came about has changed from that reducing deficits to permitting dramatically increased deficits.
You're absolutely right. So I believe that the Budget Reconciliation Act, it was like, I think 1974 is when it came around.
Wow.
I don't think it was actually used until like the early 80s. And there is a trend where it was sort of used sparingly at the outset and certainly with the intention of reducing deficits, where now it seems like every time we're trying to pass a law that has to do with deficit or budget or funding, Congress is always going the reconciliation route because the party in charge, right? That's the only way they can get a law passed. There's just too much division. So I think we're going to see it more in the future, but certainly the way it's being used now is different than what was there. But I think this is probably a good segue to talk about how does reconciliation work? Like, why is this different than just Congress coming up with a bill and then both sides debating it and passing it? In reconciliation, there's sort of two basic phases that happen in the process. In the first phase, each of the House and the Senate adopt a budget resolution, and that resolution has certain directives to various committees. Those committees are supposed to come up with draft legislation that provides for spending money, raising money, or changing the public debt limit. Budget reconciliation is limited to things that are impacting the budget and limited to things dealing with the public debt limit. Not every type of legislation can go through the reconciliation process. It's just things affecting the budget. But that, of course, means that tax is up for grabs because tax is always going to impact the budget. Phase two, then, is where the committees actually go and they do their drafting and they come up with their law and they say, oh, here's where it is. Here's our draft. But some other constraints under budget reconciliation that are really important is that laws passed under budget reconciliation cannot touch Social Security. You can't change Social Security administration. You can't change benefits that people would actually get. Budget reconciliation cannot be used for that. And then there's also everybody's favorite rule, the Byrd rule, where any provision in the draft legislation that is deemed extraneous to spending, raising revenue, or anything to do with the public debt limit is basically thrown out of the law. So anything that's not really targeting reducing the deficit or trying to raise government revenue in some way, it's going to get thrown out of the law. And in some ways, that kind of makes sense, right? Because it keeps Congress from using this process to draft and put in all sorts of rules and regulations where they wouldn't have to have 60 votes in the Senate. So it's kind of a necessary evil to this whole process. When I always tell people that are not in the tax world and they're maybe not really paying attention to reconciliation and what's going on, I think that when the general public, when I go to Thanksgiving dinner with my family and they want to talk about tax legislation, the general public, what they think is that Congress sits around and they all have their own views of what would be fair for a tax system, what would make sense. And I think the general public get very frustrated with Congress because they always say, well, that's not fair. That's not a fair tax rule, or that doesn't make sense, or who would think of that? And then, of course, I think the general public recognizes that there are also lobbyists behind the scenes, right, that are going to congressional members saying, hey, if you want my votes, or my constituents. This is really what we need. And so you do get some special interest groups. But people think that's how our tax laws are made. And unfortunately, with reconciliation, that is not how our tax laws are made. Congress is not necessarily thinking about what's fair. They're not thinking about what would make the most sense for a tax system. What they are thinking about under budget reconciliation is in the instructions given to the committees in the House and Senate, we have to have a number that says, hey, we're comfortable with increasing the United States deficit by this many billion or trillion dollars. And all of the tax provisions that are in that legislation, they have to go through and score them and say, oh, that one's a revenue raiser. Oh, this one's going to cost us money. And they have to get to that number to make sure that it fits within the budget that's passed. And so as a result, you get these weird tax rules that people just might not always think like, gee, that doesn't make sense. Or, wow, that's such a weird percentage to use. That's such a weird tax rate to use. But it's all because they're scoring each of these provisions to try to get to that number in reconciliation. I always tell people, listen, I'm sorry, but it is not about what's fair. And it's not about what makes sense.
This is all really interesting and new to me, but is it accurate or semi-accurate to note here that at the end of the day, I'm kind of seeing what looks like a range between that mess of tax cuts that come out like between $4 and just over $5 trillion. Is that range fair? Is that what we're looking at?
Yeah. So before we get to where the House and the Senate are on those numbers, I think kind of a good baseline example. So we mentioned, right, that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed under the reconciliation method. And just as an example, the instruction that was given for that law was that it couldn't increase the deficit by more than $1.5 trillion over a 10-year horizon. So that meant that every single provision that went into the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act had to be scored as either a revenue raiser or something that would cost money. And they would have to look at it 10 years out and decide, did we meet that where we didn't increase the deficit by more than $1.5 trillion? That was 2017 and 2018. Now, like Mary said, the numbers that we're talking about, the instructions, are more on the magnitude of 4 to 5 trillion. Very different. So what's happened, the House and the Senate finally passed their budget. They came to an agreement. But what's really odd with this is that the instructions that they put in the resolutions are a little bit different for the House and the Senate. The House's instructions are that they can spend $4.5 trillion on tax cuts, provided that they are also able to find $2 trillion in spending cuts in other places. But the Senate's instructions are that they can spend $1.5 trillion on tax cuts. It's going to be interesting to see that play out because at some point that's going to result in wildly different outcomes. And to add some more color to that, there's also a couple of other things going on behind the scenes. When it comes to scoring, I think a lot of people have the question, well, who's in charge of scoring? Who does this? The Congressional Budget Office puts together the scoring. The estimate that CBO, Congressional Budget Office, has put out there now it's been out for, I think now almost a year, that if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act were extended as is, the cost of that is like about 4.6 trillion. I can't even wrap my brain around 4.6 trillion.
So it's almost like we're talking about pretend numbers at this point, honestly.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's massive, right? So that's the number we're dealing with. But the other thing that has been raised in these budgets, which is huge in the budget instructions, is that not only does the Senate, can they do 1.5 trillion in tax cuts, but also the Senate has in their instructions that they can use I'll call it a novel scoring method. And what that is, when the Congressional Budget Office does their scoring on all the different provisions and say, gee, does this raise revenue or would this cost the government money? There's something called current policy method and also current law method. The 4.6 trillion estimate of extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is based on a current law method, meaning that at the end of 2025, we know a bunch of provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act are going to expire. If we want to extend them beyond 2025, doing so costs money. So, for example, the current top marginal federal income tax rate for individuals is 37%. Under the TCJA, it was made 37%. It was lowered from 39.6%. That is one of the many provisions that's set to expire. So if Congress does nothing, that 37% increases to 39.6%. The current law method of scoring says if you want to extend this 37% beyond 2025, that costs money to do. Because otherwise, under current law, that rate would expire and it would increase to 39.6. Current policy method, however, is where you look at the law as is currently, and you don't have to take into effect basically that it's going to expire. So under the Senate's method, the instruction that they want to use for the Congressional Budget Office scoring of current policy, extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act would cost nothing.
That's
This is
convenient.
wildly, this is novel. This is new. And Mary, I think, said this earlier where, I mean, there's all sorts of things in the news, and you can imagine people are kind of having a field day with calling this magic math, but it is a little terrifying to think of because this hasn't really been done before.
So I have a quick question. Is there any accountability here? You mentioned when they passed the TCJA, for example, they set the parameters and they said this cannot increase the deficit by X amount or whatever the parameters were. When they're looking back at it now, with the expectation to potentially extend, do they score it in hindsight to see, did we accomplish what we set out to accomplish? Is there any accountability?
Is there accountability?
No, that's what's scary about it is that there's really the Congressional Budget Office specifically. I mean, they're not tasked with, okay, you said 10 years from now, this would be the number. Let's check in and make sure. There's nothing like that. And so the current policy method, if that's used, opens the doors for what does the future look like with reconciliation bills if we're going to accept that as a scoring method. I do think that there have been kind of some chatter and some articles out there about, the Senate. I think the idea that the Republicans had in trying to push current policy method is that President Trump made a lot of tax-related campaign promises, and a lot of those promises kind of go beyond the tax cuts in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So the idea, I think, behind this current policy method is, hey, if we as Congress want to, one, extend the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act as is, but two, also come through on some of Trump's campaign promises like no tax on overtime, no tax on things like
Social
that.
Security. Yeah.
We need some extra wiggle room to be able to fit it into the reconciliation process. And so I think that's really what's driving it and why it's been used. But I've also seen where there are folks saying out there that it's really kind of dangerous for the Senate to have put this in the instructions because the Senate parliamentarian holds a lot of power in the reconciliation process. And they could end up kind of throwing a wrench into all of this and saying, look, there's no way we're scoring anything like this. We're not accepting this is not going through. And it could kind of really end up killing portions of this tax bill before they really even get down the road very far into, which tax provisions change, what gets changed, what's out. And so I think it's going to be a real battle. And I think too that this concept of current policy versus current law, if you do have concerns about the deficit and how tax laws impact the deficit, regardless of political affiliation, I think it's very hard to use the current policy method with a straight face. Now, on the other hand, I think, right, there are people out there who would take the position that the deficit doesn't really matter. And in addition to that, the scoring method that's used even under current law, where you're making all these estimates about, gee, if, get rid of a certain deduction, what is the economic impact of that for 10 years? I mean, I think rightly so, right? There are people that are going, who knows? Who can estimate that? Why do we even believe the current law estimates? And so a lot of the arguments when people say, gosh, extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that's going to cost us $4.6 trillion. A lot of arguments you hear is, well, yes, but that doesn't take into account a raging, growing, vibrant economy, like things like that.
I would ask that if that is taken into consideration at all, big picture, because what I saw with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and really the Inflation Reduction Act too, with tax credits and incentives and things that are really intended, they have a dual purpose, whether it's for the environment, ESG, whatever it may be, or you look at improving distressed communities with qualified opportunity zones or some of the other provisions. The other purpose really is to spur economic development and give incentive for U.S. manufacturers, for example, or U.S. companies or oil and gas companies too, for putting in renewable energy products building that into their business model as well. So I've always been curious as to whether any of that was even taken into account or how you even quantify that without looking in hindsight, which it sounds like they don't really do a whole lot.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't know how much I don't think they factor any of that in because they can't really measure it.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of begs the question of, well, do we really care about the deficit and what impact this may or may not have on the deficit? And just to kind of go back in time in history again, it is interesting. I will not tell anyone here what I was doing in 1986, but certainly the 1986 tax code reformation was the largest and most significant changes to our tax laws. That process, while reconciliation was not specifically used, the behind the scenes of it, if you ever read about how that law was made and how we got there and what President Reagan was really focused on, it very much had a reconciliation type process behind the scenes flavor to it. Reagan's whole goal was to lower the top marginal tax rates because as a movie star, he didn't want to be subject to 90% on his income. And there was also a need to reduce corporate tax rates at the time. But the way that they did it, the way that they got that law passed and they got people to agree to it was basically like reconciliation, where behind the scenes, they had people scoring the various tweaks that they made to the tax code to see would it raise revenue or would it decrease revenue. And the whole purpose was, look, we want to reduce the rates so that optically it looks like we've had very good tax reform for America. But the way they did it is they got rid of a lot of deductions for businesses, a lot of deductions for individuals, a lot of things that I hate the term, but people will call loopholes. So while it wasn't necessarily reconciliation, it's very much what still goes on in reconciliation today and how we're going to end up with what gets left in, what gets left out. Because it seems like Congress, when it comes to tax, they do have this bent of, well, if we want to create a deduction or we want to give this group a break, we've got to raise revenue somewhere else in the system.
Yeah, that's interesting. So speaking of the different provisions, and I'm sure you're going to get into this, but I have so many clients that ask me constantly, It's like magic 8-ball questions that are impossible to answer, but I'm curious your thoughts and kind of as far as specific provisions on the table up for potential cut, worst case scenario, best case scenario, specifically bonus depreciation, as in so many of my conversations with clients right now, 100% bonus depreciation, and some of the others. I'm curious where some of that is landing in these preliminary conversations, or what you think is going to happen with some of the more popular TCJA provisions.
So I think that we're probably going to see an extension of a lot of the expiring TCJA provisions. Unfortunately, I think they're not going to be able to extend it as long as they want, given the costs involved in the reconciliation process and budgetary scoring. I think probably what'll happen is we're going to get an extension that'll kick the can down the road to the next election. And then this will be everybody's problem again in 4-5 years. So I think we're going to see an extension of most things. But there are a few things that may get added in. And there's also some things that'll change. I think the big one that you always see in the news, and really Congress, it's top of mind, is the SALT cap. So the SALT cap is a limit on the amount of state and local taxes that individuals can deduct on their federal tax returns. Prior to the TCJA, there wasn't a limit. Now the limit is $10,000 per taxpayer, which is extremely limiting for a lot of people, but particularly for people who live in states that have higher taxes all around, whether it's income or property taxes. A lot of congressional members do not like the SALT cap, and this affects both sides of the aisle. So there's a lot of a push in Congress that if the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is extended, one of the features of it that they don't want to extend is the SALT cap. They either want it to expire, or what's more likely is it'll probably get increased a little bit. And the SALT cap was somewhat of an ingenious tax play at the time, because they used it as a to pay for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but also for the Republicans, they got to kind of, at first, until their own states started hitting it, right, they got to kind of laugh and say like, oh, well, it really only impacts high income taxpayers. So see, we did something good. So it's an interesting little study in politics and tax when you look at the SALT cap. But I think we'll see some movement there. I think it'll probably increase, but I'm not sure that it'll go away, because to make it go away is going to be very expensive.
I agree, Chrissy. I have a list of 3 or 4 in my mind of the biggest obstacles, and SALT cap is number 1 or 2. I've followed it a bit, and if I were to forecast things, I think we're going to see an increase. I'm curious. Taxplaining likes fun stuff. I'm curious about what's being floated around out there called the sea salt as a way to kind of clear that obstacle. I don't know if you have any thoughts of that. I'm curious, like how likely that really is, or if it's just this novel idea, not likely to go through. But I agree with everything you just said. I am just kind of curious about this new sea salt aspect.
So the sea salt would be a cap on state income taxes that corporations are able to deduct on their federal tax return. I think it's been floated because it's an attractive pay-for option and it's scoring, but I don't think it's very likely, because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I mean, one of the things it did that was actually permanent and not just temporary was it lowered the corporate income tax rate from 35% to a flat 21%. And President Trump, during his campaign, actually expressed a lot of interest in trying to further reduce the corporate income tax rate to like 15%. And so while I don't think that's necessarily realistic, I think having a sea salt cap would kind of go against the concept of, hey, if we can fit this in, we'd really like to lower the corporate rate even more. So I'm not sure that there's I think we're going to have people in Congress that are not in favor of like, hey, look, if you're going to find a pay for, please do not inject another salt cap.
Not that. Yeah.
But stranger things have happened. It's an idea for sure. I mean, some of the other things too that we're seeing are Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. One of the ideas of coming up for a pay for is to repeal a lot of the renewable energy tax credits that were either created or given a significant boost with the Inflation Reduction Act. On a scoring metric, it's overall a bigger item, but it doesn't get anywhere close to the $4.5 trillion cost. So it's not insignificant, but it's also not the silver bullet that the Republicans need. But even more importantly, a lot of Republican districts have benefited from those tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act. The Republicans will have a tough time having a unified approach on, do we repeal those credits or what do we do with them? But we might see a reduction in some of them, which I think would throw that whole industry into chaos, which is another problem. But that could be something we see. The other kind of pay for ideas that have been floated that I've seen are further lowering the mortgage interest deduction. I would think that most congressional members want to stay as far away from that as possible. That is not going to be popular with American homeowners at all. So I just can't imagine that flying.
Especially with the high interest rates historically that we've been seeing as of late. I know I've seen even real estate professionals promote on social media, the interest rates are high, but overall you get a tax deduction and all these other good things with buying a home. And at the end of the day, it's not that bad. And it's kind of, I think it would come across as a little bit of a bait and switch for those who maybe bought their first home recently, got into some higher interest rates and, would have kind of big regrets there.
I totally agree. I don't see that being a viable pay for Congress to use without significant backlash from voters.
So far, you're hitting my target list. I think the last one on my list, and I feel like just even speaking it gets a lot of people across both aisles worked up, but Medicaid. Is there going to be a limit on Medicaid cuts, or are we just like, how much is that going to possibly be attacked?
And that's a huge question right now. And certainly the Democrats are using that as kind of their, see, we told you the only way they were going to be able to do this is Medicaid. And so I think that Congress wants to avoid that as much as they can. But based on the numbers, I don't know if that's possible.
I'm going to project it's not to some degree. So my concern is, how much of a limit? Because I'm feeling like it's in jeopardy. And I'm not like saying that to be, biased one way or the other, but I've looked at some of these numbers and I'm not seeing how it can't be. So
it reminds me, do you guys remember the political ads? I want to say when it was Mitt Romney running, where it was, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it was him pushing an old lady off of a cliff in a wheelchair. This whole conversation is just reminding me of that, like with some of the things that they're, to face reality and actually accomplish what they're supposed to accomplish within these rules of reconciliation, for example, or just, their duty as stewards of our American tax dollars.
Right.
There are so many things that are going to be, I feel like, unpopular that are potentially on the table, and none of them want to risk that type of exposure, but they may have to go there to get some of this accomplished.
Yeah. And that's why I think that the timeframes that have been thrown out there are unrealistic, because I think there's going to be a lot of different factions in the Republican Party that have serious concerns about various aspects of everything to go in the tax bill. And there aren't really a lot of big pay for items that anyone's been able to put out there so far. Other ideas that have been floated are getting rid of the exclusion for employer provided benefits. So fringe benefits at work, like a lot of times those are provided by the employer to the employee, and they're taxable income to the employee. Well, one idea was like, hey, we should start taxing if you get a gym membership or something like that that your employer provides. One, it's not a huge pay for it. And two, that would be super unpopular with the general public.
Yeah.
So for Congress to push that doesn't make sense. I think there are some other ideas that would be more favorable to most of the general public to raise money. So one of them is whether the tax bill would include basically increased taxes for millionaires or ultra wealthy. And initially, Trump was kind of in favor of that. And it's certainly attractive as a pay for, but lo and behold, there are enough millionaires that a lot of people in Congress do not like this.
Have a tinfoil hat question, and we may edit this out, but has there been any talk about a robot tax? We're at this part of history now where there are jobs, if not already being actively replaced by AI, it's on the horizon. And when you're no longer getting the tax dollars from the employees that don't have their jobs, are we going to start taxing AI? Is this being talked about? Is that a way to, I don't know. I'm just putting it out there. Like I said, we may edit Mary out there.
I haven't seen anything on it. I think it's a super interesting question. I think just off the top of my head, I think the challenge with it is that because behind AI is still people, right? It's still a company or someone
We're
that
still kind of,
invested
yeah.
money, and it's kind of like robbing Peter to pay Paul. But
Mhm.
our government loves to rob Peter to pay Paul. We do it
That's
all.
right.
So, I don't think that's super unrealistic.
If I'm going to
Some
bet,
point.
yeah, I think in the near future, I don't know why I'm predicting. It's probably the flu I think I'm fighting, but I normally don't make predictions, do I, Ashley? But I feel like we are at this precipice and we need to face the fact that if we continue on this trajectory, there are going to be significant numbers of people displaced by AI. And we have to recoup that gap somewhere. And maybe there's a way to be more proactive, step back and start taxing it ahead of time. And I don't know. I'm in my tinfoil hat moment. So
But see, and this is a great example, right? Because you're thinking about policy and what would make sense and what we need to do going forward. Reconciliation doesn't think that way, right? What costs money? Where should we end up? And someone has to make these estimates and tell us 10 years from now what this looks like. And, it is interesting too, because when you think about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, so that was passed late 2017, effective 2018, just 2 years later, we had the pandemic. No one could have predicted,
right.
how that would have turned up and the different economic impacts all of that had. So there's always the unknowns when you're making those predictions. But I guess to sort of hit on some of the other things we might see in this law, Trump has expressed an interest in officially closing the carried interest loophole. I think that it would look good and we might definitely see something on that, but it's not a very high revenue raiser. I actually think that's a lot harder to close just because of how the tax laws are on carried interest. But I feel like that's actually a whole nother podcast session that we can do because it's such a complex topic. But I think that the proposals out there for how you get around the rule and everything, I think it's a lot harder to get rid of than what people in Congress make it seem like. And then there's a lot of goals that Trump wants in this. He wants no tax on tips, overtime, and Social Security, maybe an elimination of the new corporate alternative minimum tax that was put in place under the IRA, although that tax only impacts the super big companies of the world, like the Googles and Amazons. He's even floated eliminating estate tax completely. And he also wants a deduction for interest payments for car loans if you're buying a car that was manufactured in America. That, at least to me, is like, okay, at least there's a policy behind that one. But these are a lot of extra things that, in addition to extending all of the expiring provisions of the TCJA, Congress is really right now grappling with how do we draft this in? How do we score it? How do we get this through? And that's actually made me think that I bet Congress is using AI to do their drafting in some way.
Oh, sure. And what you just said prompted me to ask you one more thing. It made me think about tariffs, which everybody's talking about in some capacity these days. And my understanding is tariffs are not, they are derived from the executive branch, and so they are not factored into the metrics, the scoring algorithm, whatever it is. Why can't we, at this new historic time, introduce the discussion seriously about good or bad factoring tariffs into that scoring mechanism? I mean, I've heard kind of whispers about it, but I'm just surprised because I think we all have to face that it is a reality right now. I mean, whether it works out or not, it's going to impact, right?
Yeah. And, part of Trump's campaign promises were wanting basically to replace the IRS with an external revenue service that's collecting all these tariffs and then basically saying if you earn less than $200,000 a year, you're now exempt from US federal income taxation, with the idea that the tariffs would be the offset for that. So certainly I think there are some in the Republican Party that they really do want the tariffs into the score as a revenue raiser. I think there's a challenge with that of like, okay, we've never done this before. And I think that politically it will be hard to do because the tariffs are so unpopular. But I do think it's a legitimate question of, well, if we're looking at economic impacts of this and what this really looks like, why shouldn't we factor in, what's going on? One of the clear challenges with that is the tariff seems to change on a daily basis. So it's kind of interesting, right? Because whatever the tariffs look like now, that might look very different 6 months from now or even 3 months from now. So depending on how quickly they kind of rally behind this legislation and if they can get this passed, what the tariffs look like now might be totally different at that time.
Great point. Yeah.
No, that's interesting. Speaking of things looking totally different, I do want to get your thoughts on the upheaval within the IRS and the massive layoffs, reorganization. Mary, and I'm sure you're dealing with it too on the tax controversy side. We're seeing things happen that are just unprecedented because the IRS was already stretched thin. They were probably still trying to implement some of the TCJA provisions, honestly, and then figure out how to audit those. Now we're going to have sweeping legislation yet again when they're even more short-staffed. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on the impact there and their ability to actually implement and enforce these changes.
I think it's going to be a real challenge. Family and friends and some clients are now asking me the questions of like, why should I even care about taxes? Who's going to enforce this? And certainly the IRS has had all this upheaval. So unfortunately, I think what it all means is that the IRS's focus in the short term is probably low-hanging fruit, things that whoever's left there can kind of easily find. But this is a huge issue when you're looking at tax legislation coming in because our tax laws nowadays, when they're drafted, they always have some provision in the different sections, right? That's like the secretary is authorized to draft regulations addressing this aspect of this law.
Right.
And so what happens is until the regs come out, no one really has a firm grasp of what the various rules are. So if you don't get regulations or if you don't get some sort of IRS notice or something like that has some guidance in it, taxpayers are really left with a super uncertain landscape. I think with the TCJA, a good example of that was the qualified business income deduction, the 199 Cap A deduction, where when it first came out, people were like, this is great and an extra deduction. And then you start reading it and you're like, wait a minute, this is the most confusing deduction I've ever seen. Do I get to deduct 20% or not? And then, of course, it's like, well, wait, 20% of what? So until the regs came out for that, people really weren't sure how it was going to benefit them. And then also could they do things to kind of better position themselves with that deduction? Like, I hate it, but it is true in a lot of cases, right? Like, oh, I guess I should elect S Corp status, things like that. So I think, unfortunately, with tax legislation, depending on what we see, if we get a lot more than just an extension of the current Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, if we get a lot of other things, chances are the actual text of the Internal Revenue Code that gets drafted is pretty tiny, pretty short, at least from our perspective as tax advisors. And so what clients need to know the details of how it all works, we're just not going to know. People are going to have to take some risks, I think, when they're doing tax planning and filing tax returns and taking positions, because we're just not going to see the guidance that people need. And the other thing I tell people is that we're in this phase with the IRS kind of getting whittled down, but chances are 4 years from now, 8 years from now, whatever the time frame is, it's going to look very different. But the IRS, I think people have to remember that I always tell clients, like, look, if you get a worker classification notice and the IRS wants to look into that, you better get yourself prepared, because the IRS is very good at worker classification audits. The reason the IRS is good at them is they can take anybody off the street and teach them about, do you have control over your own schedule? Do you provide your own supplies for your job? Or does your hiring firm do it for you? All these sorts of kind of basic questions. Where the IRS struggles, though, is, oh, this is a complex area of partnership tax law that we would like to look at. Well, the IRS has a hard time attracting and keeping talent in those areas. And so one of the unfortunate things is that I think the IRS in the future will be able to do the low-hanging fruit things and probably do them reasonably well. But when it comes to the more complex things, they're just not going to be on the radar.
I think I mostly agree with you, but I will caveat it and say again that with the rise of AI, I'm I'm not as willing as I would have been before to be like, yep, absolutely. I think it's increasingly sophisticated, and we'll get to levels where those, what you point out rightly, those sophisticated areas are, sort of a hole there right now. I think they're going to get filled in, and AI will, if done correctly, will lead the charge there and kind of fill those gaps.
As long as they don't use the AI that they used for
Exactly.
ERC disallowance letters.
Yeah. Well, first they have to get their computers out of the 1960s anyway. I mean, I recognize this is not going to happen tomorrow, but I think there is that mindset. Look, if we do this right in 4 years, 8 years, whatever, we can revert back to what we envisioned the IRS being capable of doing all along, for good or bad. I'm not committing to how I feel about that here, but I think AI, if managed and wielded a certain way, the future is very different than the immediate 4 years we're looking at right now.
I totally agree. And that's what I mean. I've told clients that, hey, I know that you might not be worried about this now because it seems like the IRS is now not paying attention. But if they do start using AI and more software, they're going to be able to catch a lot of things that way that before they really weren't able to. And you want to be able to sleep through the night and not worry about what will happen 6 years from now. But just a simple example, we've seen a slew of conservation easement challenges from the IRS over the past couple of years. And rightly so, because there have been some abuses in that area. And that's, to me, would be an easy area for AI to take over, right? If you
I
are
see
someone
that. Yeah.
claiming a large charitable donation deduction and it's of non-cash property and it's at a certain level. And I mean, that to me is like AI could super easily flag everything like that and look at that. And so I think we will see a lot more of that in the coming years.
Very exciting time to be in tax, I think.
Yeah.
Never a dull moment.
No, always changing. I honestly don't have anything else. So thank you so much. I feel like I learned a lot actually today.
I
Well,
learned a lot. Yeah.
we'll have a tax girl summer for sure.
Yes. And to
Oh,
that
yeah.
point, I think maybe it's good to let the viewers know, if I'm correct, you'll be the expert here, but that is something about this. There's really no time limit, right? Other than the time limit with the expiration, the
Yep.
TCJA provisions that are expiring, time limit. So I know we have this kind of, it almost feels like an artificially ramped up, get it through and it keeps being moved along. But in reality, there's no time mechanism forcing this to happen any sooner than before the end of the year, really.
That's right. I think the one thing there, which actually we haven't mentioned this entire discussion, so it's probably worth talking about real quick.
Yeah.
Estate taxes. Under the TCJA, it basically doubled the federal estate tax exemption for people. So that was huge. If the provisions expire, then we now have this issue, right, where now the exemption it gets cut in half. So it's a huge reduction. So while technically Congress does have until literally December 31st to figure this out, people in the estate planning community, really working with really wealthy taxpayers, they're terrified about this. I mean, they've
Ugh.
honestly been looking at this for the last couple of years, making moves with things, planning that, gosh, that my exemption might get cut in half. So I think there are people in Congress that they really do want to get this legislation, I would think by the fall, like mid-fall. They don't want to drag this into December, but at the same time, they can.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great, Chrissy. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
welcome.
And we'll continue to
Yes, thank you.
follow your posts and updates because you're usually one of and I look for like what's going on with the legislation.
Same.
on Chrissy's LinkedIn.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Chrissy.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.